being the most expensive is likely to lead to a lower conversion rate and really hard work to get sales. Being the cheapest, on the other hand, is equally dangerous because you're coming up against your price leaders, your, Walmarts, Costco's, Targets, Kmart. That's not a space I want to be in either. I also think that that's just not a clever product, not always, but not a clever product. Like I want unique selling points that are special and problem solving, not, hey, we are the cheapest. All right, so in today's episode, we're going to talk about pricing, and that's where the journey to profitability begins and where so many brands make mistakes. How do you price your products? So let's take a few steps back, right? So existentially, you know that we're looking for a healthy bottom line, a healthy net profit. Now, for me, a healthy net profit is anything over 20, 25, 30%. I think under 20% is a little low, but sure, if you're turning over hundreds of millions of dollars, 15% profit is great. Nonetheless, it starts with pricing. Now, you see a lot of businesses come to me, particularly taking my program or my course, and they're trying to be more profitable. And it starts for me by analyzing their unit economics. In other words, what's their margin on their product? Well, their COGS, So just a quick breakdown on what that means. Your COGS is cost of goods sold, is what you pay for the product, including any importation costs. And that's usually expressed as a percentage. So if I sell an item for $100 and I buy it for $30, I have a 30% COG or a 70% margin. If I have an 80% margin, I have a 20% COG. 80 plus 20 equals 100. If I have a 60% margin, I've got to get to 100. I have a 40% COG. 60 plus 40 equals 100. 90% margin, you guessed it, 10% COG. So where I want to be with pricing is above 70%. That's where I want my margin to be. Now, big caveat here that there's people going to be listening to this who are doing maybe alcohol, you're probably getting a 30, 40% margin, furniture, 30 to 40% margin as well. I totally get it, right? There's different margins. Clothing, you can get 75 up to 80% in beauty. There's good margins and there's not good margins. Doesn't mean that not good margin business won't work. No, it just means that you have to adjust your ratios. So again, if we have a 50, 30, 20, which is my 50, 30, 20 framework, and your gross profit margin is 50%, your operating expenses are 30%, your net profit is 20, let's say that your 50% gross profit is actually 40. Well, if you want to hit a net profit of 20%, your ratio becomes 40, 20, 20. So instead of 30% operating expenses, you have to go lean and spend 20% running your business. So that means you've got to probably cut marketing, cut staff, and so on. The margin in your product is the wiggle room. Okay, so that's the fat, that's the cream that allows you to invest. So that's why it's so important to start with a strong margin. So when you're looking at pricing your products, how do you do that? Great. First step, I have a two-step approach to pricing. And the first step is to take your landed cost of goods and divide it by 0.3. If you take that price, so your landed cost of goods sold, including shipping, let's divide that by 0.3. That's going to give you a 70% margin. So the number that spits out there is what you need to sell your product for to get a 70% margin. Put your tax on top of that, 10%, 15% sales tax, in whatever country you are. So that's how you calculate a 70% margin. And I have these pricing calculators that I give to the students in my course to calculate it, but nonetheless, if you're listening to this, that's how you do it. So if you want to price for an 80% margin, take your cost price, your landed cost of goods sold, and divide it by 0.2. That gives you your price for an 80% margin. I wouldn't go below 70% if you don't have to. Just as a benchmark, I try and stay above 70%. That's a healthy range. It means you can afford to spend 15 to 18% on marketing and so on. So that's a healthy range, right? So if you take your product, you divide it by 0.3, and it gives you this number. That number is your retail price less tax. Take that number and benchmark it against your top 3 to 5 competitors. And you don't want to be, in my opinion, this is only my strategy, you don't want to be the cheapest and you don't want to be the most expensive. The reason for that is the most expensive, you start competing against big brands, designer brands. Look, those guys, that's a hard market to crack. They typically have a lot of money to build their brand and so on. Being the most expensive is likely to lead to a lower conversion rate and really hard work to get sales. Being the cheapest, on the other hand, is equally dangerous because you're coming up against your price leaders, your, Walmarts, Costco's, Targets, Kmart. That's not a space I want to be in either, because those competitors are getting much better margins than you because they order a lot more volume than you. So I get a little bit nervous when someone says, yeah, I'm the cheapest. I don't really want to be in that space. I also think that that's just not a clever product, not always, but not a clever product. Like I want unique selling points that are special and problem solving, not, hey, we are the cheapest. So that's just my thoughts, particularly geared towards, side hustles or e-hustles. You don't have to obviously take these rules, but in my experience, those two areas is where I avoid, the most expensive and the cheapest. So again, the two-step rule is 1, hit a 70% margin, and I do that by taking my cost price and dividing it by 0.3. And then 2, having a look at the number that spits out and saying, yeah, that's about in the middle of my competitors. That's a fair price. That gets a tick from me and I move on. Try and resist the temptation to say, I'll let this one slide with a 60% margin or 55% margin because volume will fix it. Let me tell you, volume doesn't really fix margins. Yes, in theory, if you're doing millions and millions of dollars, then a small margin's fine because it's a big dollar amount. Volume is stressful, right? Straight away, if you're chasing volume, if your volume isn't coming, you go on sale, you constantly chase volume. I like those businesses that even when they have slow months, they're nice and profitable, they're generating cash, the margins are good. I always play the averages. That's important to play the averages. You have a better chance of success on a 70% or above margin, and you have a better chance of getting sales if you're priced fairly. So I think the common mistakes that we make, particularly as founders, is if you own the business and you're the buyer or the designer, you have this, what I call founder bias. I see it all the time. The founder will come in and say, yeah, that's great. We can sell that for $200. And the team sort of looks around and says, yeah, I think I'd probably pay $130 for that. That's a little focus group, by the way. I think just letting the founder make those decisions is really hard. So I think you should try and get the team involved in those decisions. So I would say that there are 2 common mistakes. One is particularly founders doing their own products who price too high. And you hear this a lot, but we're a luxury brand. Well, you're probably not. That's the reality of the matter. So again, chasing an extra dollar, what for? Chasing an extra $10 or $20 on a product is really not going to change your business. I'd rather chase dollars overall than, fewer high ticket sales. Again, you don't need to be greedy. If the margin's 70%, you don't need to stretch it to 90 unless you can and you're still priced fairly in the middle. The other area founders go is selling too cheap. The reason that they do that is typically their suppliers have given them a price that's simply too high. When they run their numbers and try and get a 70% margin, it spits out a number that's a retail price that's on the really high end. So what they'll do is they'll drop the price down to be competitive. But what you're doing there is you're dropping the price, which is great, ticks one box, it's a nice retail price, but the margin starts to drop to 60 to 55. You're under pressure. You're under pressure to start running your business on 20% operating expenses. Pack it in, it's too hard. Now, I know how hard it is to say no to a product that has a bad margin or that's too expensive, but you have to. It's really important to work with your suppliers to find a price that suits your margin and your customers' target price as well. Something you can do is provide target pricing to your suppliers to really just get straight to the point. This is the margin I need. This is what I need to buy it for. This is what I need to sell it for. Again, tools like my pricing calculator will do that for you, but you've really got to zero in on that pricing. If you're waiting till the item comes in, you've imported it, you've got it in your warehouse, and then you're saying, how much should we sell this for? That's going about things in the wrong order. So I think the way that businesses need to think about unit economics is firstly, think about unit economics, because that's where it starts. I always say the best way to grow your profitability is just start scrutinizing your numbers, and it'll never stop surprising me how many people don't scrutinize their numbers. Start looking at them. This is the trick, guys. So often I work with a brand and I'll just start illuminating numbers and they're saying, oh, wow, I didn't know that. I can just change that price, improve my margin by 3%. Scrutinize your numbers and take the time to learn them. You're in business. You're not just selling fashion or beauty. You're in business. This is a serious business you're trying to build. You need to have a good grasp of your numbers. So I think just reiterating, when it comes to unit economics, aim for the 70%. on the intake margin, in other words, what I buy it for versus what I sell it for. Once you've taken away your other cost of sales like freight to the customer and merchant fees, you want to be no less than 50% gross margin, 55 ideally. So here's a quick tip. If you're starting with an intake margin of 70%, by the time you add your other cost of sales, freight, merchant fees and so on, I don't want to see you dropping more than 15% off there. So it might be 70% margin on the product minus 10% outbound freight to the customer, 3% merchant fees. You want to end with your gross profit margin at 55, 70 minus 15. If you're going from 70 down to 50, that means you're spending 20% on other cost of sales. You're probably getting a little bit rinsed on something like your freight or your packaging and so on. So remember, I'm all about benchmarks. It's not about teaching you how to improve your brand or your product or whatever. It's about giving you the parameters. And these are some parameters to remember. Whatever your intake margin is, aim for over 50. Try and subtract no more than 15% for your other cost of sales. And just remember to zero in on those unit economics and understand exactly how much you're spending on getting your product in and getting it out to the customer. So once again, focus on avoiding the extremes when it comes to pricing. Avoiding the extremes means I don't want to be up the top. That's not a space I want to be. Let's leave that for the luxury players with the big budgets. I don't want to be on the bottom either, because that's for your Aldis, your Costco's, your Walmart. That's for brands with much, much bigger margins than me through volume and bigger budgets. I don't want to be in a race to the bottom. Where do I want to be? A nice problem-solving product with a 70% or better intake margin, a 55% gross profit margin ideally, and I just want to be priced fairly in the middle so that the customer says, yep, I see that. That's a fair price. Great features in the product I'm purchasing. If you want to check whether or not your pricing's on track, you could certainly use a tool like my pricing calculator. But if you've already bought products and it's too late for you to price them because they're on your website and you're thinking, how do I check the margin? Here's a little formula for you. So what you want to do, always less tax, is take your retail price, less tax, subtract your cost price, and divide that number by your retail price, less tax. That number, expressed as a percentage, is going to be your margin. So just once again, if you're an existing retailer, you're selling products, you want to check your margin, the formula is retail price, no tax on it, less cost of goods sold. So again, what you paid for it, the product, plus what you paid to import the product, divided by retail price, less tax. That'll spit out a number, turn that number into a percentage, and that's how you check the margin on your products at the moment. So what I want to leave you with in today's episode is that pricing is where it all starts when it comes to margin. Don't cut corners. Don't price poorly for yourself, give yourself a bad margin and think that it'll improve. It generally doesn't. Sometimes I'm the bearer of bad news and I say, well, you're going to have to do such enormous volume for that low margin business to work. It's better to focus on high margin products. That makes everything infinitely easier. Take your time. Don't drop your prices to give you a really bad margin. Don't be too greedy by lifting your prices to obtain a margin that nobody really needs, that then prices you out of the market. Keep it really simple. Don't overthink it. 70% margin on your products, intake margin that is, and then whatever number that spits out in terms of a retail price, I just want that sitting somewhere in the middle. Not up the top, that's too high for me. Not down the bottom, that's too competitive for me. I just want to be in the middle, nice and fairly with my 70% margin.